Good afternoon, ma'am. Are you there?
Good afternoon.
Please check your audio and video, ma'am.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I can't see your video. Yeah.
The video is on.
Okay. Okay, ma'am. Welcome, ma'am, to our program.
Thank you.
We will start 3 Indian time.
Shall I check my sharing my screen?
Yeah, please check.
Is it visible? Can you see it?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Fine.
We can start now.
Yeah, we are going to start now. Professor Ray and dear participants, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the NICE Economic Lecture Series. Through NICE Economic Lecture Series, we aim to invite eminent economists to discuss the contemporary economic issues at the time when the world is struggling with post-COVID recovery, which has further been hit by the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Before we start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a research think tank registered under the Companies Act 2006 of Nepal, working towards bringing in research excellence in the field of international relations, international economy, security, and development, and looking for better approaches for enhanced international cooperation and relations for a better, peaceful, and stable world. To talk about today's important topic, India and global value chains, we have a very eminent speaker, Professor Saon Ray. Professor Saon Ray earned her M.Phil and Ph.D. in economics from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and MSc in economics from the University of Calcutta. Saon Ray is a professor with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi. Prior to joining ICRIER, she held teaching and research positions at premier universities and institutions in India, including TERI University, RIS, Institute of Economic Growth, and Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is an economist specializing in industry and international trade issues. Her areas of interest include global value chains, technological upgrading of Indian industries, free trade agreements, and trade creation effects, technology transfer, foreign direct investment, efficiency and productivity of firms, financial inclusion, energy, and climate change related issues. She has published several book chapters and research papers in reputed national and international journals and edited volumes. Professor Ray, welcome to our program. Professor Ray, you have around 35 to 40 minutes to make your initial remarks, which will be followed by questions and answers. This session is of 60 minutes, and the program is streaming live on several Facebook pages and social media platforms. We would like to request all our participants to tweet about the event and also share on our live video on their social media so that maximum can benefit from the discussion. The audience can drop in their questions under Facebook Live or in Zoom chat. Now, Professor Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary. So I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Okay.
And can you see my screen? Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I am going to be talking about India and global value chains. This is some work that I have been doing since 2013 onwards. But recently you are aware of the crisis that is going on due to the Ukraine war. So towards the end of the lecture, I'll try to draw some data from what So towards the end of the lecture, I will try to draw on some data on how the current crisis that is going on in Ukraine will impact global value chains and how India could actually face the challenge or draw some inspiration from it. I am not being able to go to the next slide.
Please escape once and then try again.
Yeah. No, there is some problem. Maybe you can share the screen and I can present. I'll stop sharing.
Could you please email me your slide, ma'am?
I have emailed you, Mr. Chaudhary. I've emailed you yesterday.
Just a second.
Let me try once more.
Shall I share the?
Yes. Why don't you share?
Yeah.
I've stopped sharing.
First page. No, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chori. So the topic of my talk today is India and global value chains. Next, the overview of the presentation is that I will first talk about, I'll give an introduction to what are global value chains. I'll talk about India in the context of global value chains. I'll then briefly talk about the trends in world trade following COVID-19, as well as the current war in Ukraine, and whether or not that presents some opportunities and challenges, and finally conclude with the way ahead. Next. So we often come across this term being used, global value chains, but what exactly are global value chains? Now, they are basically separate but interlinked and coordinated activities, which can be undertaken within a single firm, or it can be divided among multiple firms in different geographical locations. And the idea is basically to bring out a product or a service from conception to completion, and post the production to delivery to final consumers. So the chain basically refers to the full range of activities involved in the value creation of a product from conception to end use. And these chains usually operate through inter-firm trade networks between a series of countries, and that is how new value is created and coordinated. Now, why are these chains important? Mainly because since the 2000 and sometime before that also, a large part of global trade is actually concentrated in intermediate goods, and it is due to these value chains, which means that several different parts of the activity would be located in different countries. They would be all coming together under what is known as a lead firm, which is a network of contract manufacturers, suppliers, logistic firms, etc. And the interesting thing that we see now is that while there are concentrations of what are called factory America, factory Asia, etc., most global value chains, though the name suggests that they are global, they are actually regional. So the concentration of activity is around a region. The Southeast Asian region is in fact a very important region as far as global value chains is concerned. And FDI, or foreign direct investment, is a very important part of this production network that is shared among the countries. Next, please. So all of you are familiar with this very typical example that is given usually of value chain. On the left side, you can see the Apple iPad, and it gives you the various parts of the iPad. So you have the touchscreen assembly, the display module, and so on. On the right, actually, what it tells you is that this refers to the iPhone parts, not the iPad specifically, that where are these parts manufactured? So for example, chip is manufactured by Texas Instruments in USA. The audio component is manufactured by Cirrus Logic again in USA. The Gorilla Glass is manufactured by Corning in Japan and other countries. The semiconductor is manufactured by TriQuint in USA or Costa Rica. The touchscreen could be manufactured by Broadcom in the USA or Mexico, and so on and so forth. But it all comes together mostly in China. So that is why this caption says that it is designed in USA, but manufactured in China, and then sold all across the world. So all the iPhones are normally manufactured and processed in this way. Next, please. So some facts about global the GVC trade. Between 1995 and 2009, income from GVC related trade increased about 6-fold for China and 5-fold for India. And several factors have been suggested as to why GVC integration is affected positively. So these could be things like regional trade agreements. It could be investment barriers to trade. It could be the activities of multinational corporations, infrastructure development, speed and flexibility of movement of physical goods and information, effectiveness of legal and regulatory systems, efficient services, skilled manpower, and then other kinds of things like, friendliness of the business climate and the capacity of the domestic firms, often SMEs or small firms, to contribute to the supply chain. Other factors which are also very important include border administration, which means that how quickly the customs offices operate, how quickly the ports turn around the goods that are shipped from one country to the other, market access barriers, transport logistics. And which means that when if you just think about the iPhone that we talked about a moment ago, all these countries that are involved in making these various parts will be exporting the part that they are manufacturing. It will be imported by the country that is next in the stage of the value chain, and then it will be further assembled finally by a country in a country like China. Now, all countries actually are engaged in both backward and forward participation. But then as Kowalski et al. Point out that the policy implications of whether they are engaged in the backward or the forward chain are different. And hence it is important to look at how a country is integrated. So what are these backward and next please, forward chains? Next. So we will come to that in a moment. If we look at the gross exports and value added of domestic value added in gross exports, they are usually what help us assess the participation of a country in a GVC. So countries which are highly engaged in GVC have a relatively lower domestic value added. And again, the example of China becomes very important. The other thing that I mentioned is trade in intermediate goods. Now, all of these parts that we talked about in the case of the iPhone are actually intermediate goods in the iPhone, and they will be crossing borders several times. And the trends in intermediate trade have been analyzed with respect to countries. And we see that if you divide them into developed, industrialized, and developing countries, mostly the East Asian countries are at the top, then followed by the CIS or the former Eastern European countries, and then there are others in between. Large developing countries are usually, they have lower engagement, and that could be because they have a larger domestic market compared to smaller countries. And developing countries are usually are led by China and Mexico, and where this GVC trade actually has been growing much faster than rest of the world. And which is why it is often said that everything that is produced in this world, some part of it has probably been manufactured in China. And that is the situation now. Next, please. So in order to understand global value chains, what we need to do is to understand the process that undergoes into making any product. So and the process is usually completed in many countries, as I mentioned, and it has arisen basically because of interconnectedness of countries or greater globalization. And this in part is because of the technological advancements in not only in transport, but other communication as well, liberalization of trade in countries, as well as demand side factors. Other reasons include a reduction in trade costs, land transport costs, freight insurance costs, tariffs and duties. And all of this basically have come together to give rise to what is known as GVC trade. Next. So then how does GVC trade work? It is basically through two things, the backward and the forward integration. Backward integration basically measures the value of imported inputs in one's own exports. And what typically happens is that intermediate inputs used in third countries for further export measures forward integration. And two other concepts are very important in this case, foreign value added and domestic value added. I just mentioned and talked about domestic value added, which is basically parts of an export that is created in a country, or DVA as a share of total value addition, and it measures the extent to which trade contributes to GDP of a country. On the other hand, foreign value added is the part of a country's gross exports that consist of inputs produced in other countries. Next. So the production sharing actually occurs in various stages of the process and located in different countries. And all that is required for GVC trade is three things: that a good must be produced in two or more sequential stages, two or more countries must provide the value add, and at least one country must use the input in its stage of production, and some resulting output must be exported. And if we, next please. Next. So the participation is really measured by the sum of two things: the domestic content in a country's export that is reused in the exports of its trade partners, and the exports of the foreign value added as a share of gross exports. And backward integration measures the value of imported inputs in overall exports of a country, and intermediate inputs used in third countries for further exports measure forward integration. Next. So it basically comes together in this diagram. In this diagram, you can see that country A is the reporting country. Through its backward GVC participation, it actually it exports something to country B or its partner. The country B adds value to that imported input from country A and exports it to a third country. And this way, the three countries are interconnected in this in the value chain. Next, please. So the value that is created in country A is domestically is consumed by country B, and then also exported by country B. And so you could see the dashes which talk about how much of value is embedded in the different countries' exports and imports. And the typical example, again, apart from the iPhone, is that you can think about the value of exports from country A to country B originating in the third country, which was the value of rubber, say, embodied in the tires of a country from country B, and country A imports the rubber from country C for the production of the tires. Next, please. Now, what this graph tells you is that on the horizontal axis, we have the foreign content of exports increase. And on the vertical axis, we have the manufacturing exports increase. Now, countries which are located to the far right in the graph, say something like Hungary, has a lot more foreign content of exports, and its manufacturing has also, export share has also increased significantly. These are the countries which are actually very well integrated in global value chains. And so Hungary is, of course, leading the pack, and you also you can see China also there. And countries which are, say, below that line are countries which are less integrated or have less value added or less participation in global value chains. And you can see that while India is above the line, it is obviously far, far below many of the other countries compared to, say, Estonia or even the Czech Republic. Next, please. So large countries like Brazil, China, and India have typically lower shares of exports in terms of vertical trade. And this is because one reason that has been given is that they have a large domestic market, which is why their share is either through backward or forward participation in GVC trade is low. And Baldwin has said that since 1970, 7 countries have gained more than 1% of world manufacturing gross domestic product. And all the G7 countries, in fact, have lost their share during this period. And you saw some of those countries in the map that I just showed, in the graph that I just showed you. But all of these countries, apart from India, are actually part of any supply chain. So, for example, Japan belongs to the East Asian supply chain, or Poland belongs to the German or the European supply chain. And this brings back the point about regional value chains and the importance of regional trade in the context of GVC. Next, please. Next. So what determines a country's participation in GVC? One, of course, is the size of the economy. So the larger the domestic market, lower the participation. The stock of natural resources, the higher the stock, the higher the participation. The distance to world markets is also a very important factor. So if you are located near the European markets or near the American markets, the chances of participation is higher because they are actually the world's consumers in some sense. It also depends on the composition of your exports. So whether you have more final goods or more intermediate goods. So the more final goods that you produce as a country, the lower is the chances of your participation. Next, please. So then I will now talk about where does India stand in terms of GVC trade. Now, this is a bit of a messy slide. There's a lot of information. So what you can see on the top is the GVC Participation Index for India, developing economies and developed economies. This is quite old. This is based on 2011 data. And it shows that the forward participation of India is about 19%, the backward participation is about 24%, and the total GVC participation for India is about 43%, which is much lower than the average of developing countries, which is about 48.6%. And then the lower panel then shows you how does this forward and backward participation break up in terms of India. I mean, what are the industries which are contributing to that? And in more recent data from OECD shows that for India, the items or the exports which are very important and contribute largely to the GVC trade is things like coke and refined petroleum, 47%, basic metals, 38%, and ICE, information and communication electronics, that is about 36.8%. The lower panels that you can see on at the bottom of the graph table of the slide is basically a comparison between 2005 and 15, depending on the backward and the forward integration of India. And in some cases, some industries do stand out. So other manufacturing, for example, stands out. And some services also do stand out compared to others. Next. Now, why is India's GVC integration low? I mean, apart from the fact that it is a large domestic market, there are some other reasons which have been given. Professor Athukurala, for example, has suggested that the import substitution policies that India followed as late as 1991 meant that India failed to fit into the global production networks, particularly in the electronic sector. And he has, in his paper, shown that for these categories, data processing machines, telecommunication and recording sound equipment, etc., India's participation has been really very small, and This is where all the East Asian countries and China have forged ahead. Overall, India's export share from the 1950s to 2011 is very small, close to about 1%, was close to about 1%. In recent times, it has increased slightly more than that, but it continues to remain quite small. Next, please. Now, this basically is from the Atlas of Complexity by Harvard. And the left panel shows you the exports of India, export baskets of India, and the right panel shows you the imports in 2018. So the maroon unspecified is all the services sector, which actually contributes a large part to India's exports. And then you have the other goods. So the things like petroleum, oil, and refined on exports is about 8.8%. Diamonds is about 4.75%, etc. But you can see that on the right panel that India does import some services also, again shown by the maroon part. And interestingly, you can see that petroleum, oils, crude, etc. form 16% of India's imports. Now, it is interesting that actually India does not have any comparative advantage in petroleum, but it does have some advantage in refining. So it does import these petroleum products in the crude form, refines them, and then sells them. And which is why you see petroleum on both the imports as well as the exports. And that in some sense is also a measure of the GVC participation. A country may actually not have the raw materials, but it may be importing some of it, the intermediate goods, and maybe processing it and exporting it. And this is one example in the context of India. Next, please. So if we look at India's foreign trade policy, especially with reference to what Professor Athukurala has mentioned, the foreign trade policy statement is usually unveiled for 5 years. The last policy was from 2015 to 2020. And it was due to COVID, it has been sort of extended by 2 years. We are expecting that this year the new foreign trade policy will be unveiled. And the two schemes which were the backbone of the foreign trade policy, the MEIS, the Merchandise Export from India scheme, and the Services Export from India scheme. The MEIS scheme has been discontinued. It has been replaced by a new scheme. Overall, you can see as far as goods is concerned, India has had a trade deficit for the entire period from 2007 to 2017-18. Goldberg et al. In fact has commented on the surge in overall imports, with real imports rising about 130% between 1987 to 2000. And this has largely become because of intermediate goods, which rose by about 227% for India in this period. Next. Now, some more statistics about how India fits in as far as trade is concerned. I will skip this slide and go to the next one. I think, and try to come to the, in fact, the end of the presentation. So participation in GVC is actually determined by 3 factors: the capacity of a country to join a GVC, be part of the production network, and it basically depends on the task that it can perform. The capacity to remain in the GVC. This basically means that how competitive it is and whether it can outcompete other suppliers and other countries essentially to remain in the value chain. And then to retain the position, whether it is doing R&D or other things, so that it can move up the value chain and secure the position in the value chain. And here the role of lead firms is very important, because this would lead to some kind of technology transfer in case of developing countries. But it also means that what kind of working conditions and other conditions prevail in the value chain, and how much profit sharing there is essentially in the value chain. Next. Now, again, two graphs. On the right, you can see that how India's exports across sectors has behaved from 1996 onwards. And on the left, what you can see is what is called the complexity or the product space. And the gray portions are where it is not usually, typically a country is not present. And the greens are, I mean, you can see lots of color on this graph. The green is the chemical sector, and then the purple reflects auto and other industries, and the yellow is usually agriculture. So you can see that in terms of the product space, there are many products that India is exporting, is competitive in, but there are also lots of gray areas where it is not doing so well. Next, please. So why does India in fact lag behind in GVC participation? And to understand that, as part of some work that we had done between 2013 and 15, a survey of about 100 firms were done in India across several sectors. And the sectors are listed at the bottom of the slide. Next, please. And so I'll just very quickly summarize this and go to the more interesting part of the presentation. There were various answers that were given for why there was low integration. For example, in garments, it was suggested that there is competition from other low-cost countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam. And India actually suffers from really high production costs, logistic costs, slow turnaround at ports, and it actually is, its garment is largely cotton based. It needs to diversify into synthetic fibers. In terms of specialty chemicals, it was suggested that while India is doing well in certain niche products, R&D is very little R&D is conducted, and actually as a country it needs to innovate into newer kinds of specialty chemicals, and some of these were suggested. Next, please. Now, certain barriers to integration were also suggested. There are some that are common across sectors. I mean, things like efficient services and infrastructure, cheap energy, availability of finance, skills, etc. But there are some sector-specific barriers also, and the next slide actually suggests what these barriers are. Next, please. So, for example, in automobiles, it was suggested that infrastructure and supply chain connectivity is a big problem. There's a long waiting time at ports. Land availability is a problem. And in other kinds of industries, other things were suggested that, in pharmaceuticals, for example, it's very good in generic medicine and all that, but it is not discovering new molecules, which means that it is not upgrading and it is not moving up the value chain. Next, please. So to summarize the findings, we found that there is need to identify the lead firm in the Indian context. The lead firm could be a multinational or it could be a domestic firm, but sometimes the lead firm was not behaving in the manner which led to more R&D, more upgrading, etc. And which means that as a country, when you are evolving in terms of your industrial policy, you need to create those lead firms or give incentives for the creation of lead firms. And some sectors were also suggested where India could do well. Electronics, hardware, aerospace. And in fact, interestingly, India since then has actually done much better in electronic hardware. There is a vibrant manufacturing right now in the country. And most often what has happened is that favorable government policy has really helped these sectors. And I mean, in recent times, India has had a couple of new policies which have really worked well and are working well. The most prominent of them is, of course, the PLI scheme, or the production linked incentive scheme. Next. Now I'll skip this slide and the next one. We can skip this. So then what needs to be done to improve the environment? business environment, of course, needs to be improved so that entrepreneurs basically can take the risk and invest money. Logistics were a problem cited across many sectors and need to be improved. So not only the logistic costs, but the time taken for things to move around. Then there were issues like compliance with standards, which was very important in the chemical and the pharmaceutical industry. And then there were certain things that were suggested that while you may actually have policies, most countries have policies to join global value chains, but most countries don't have policies to how should they remain part of GVCs, how should they remain competitive, and how should they upgrade, do R&D, and move up the value chain. And India is no exception there. These policies are actually lacking in the country. Next, please. So now I'll come to the impact of COVID and the Ukraine war and see what it portends. Now, we know what happened right in 2020, April 2020 or so. World merchandise fell significantly. And then there was a recovery in the third and fourth quarter, but then global GDP also fell. It was not uniform. It fell, while it fell for most countries, the sharpest decline was for Asia in some cases. But then the recovery also was led by Asia, which was very interesting. Next, please. And this basically shows you that the trade in manufactured goods, how much it fell and which were the industries in which it did not fall. So for most industries on the left, you can see that for them, it was a negative or it fell sharply. This is data from 2020. And on the right, you can see the industries where it did not fall. So for example, textiles, it did not fall. For computers and integrated circuits, it did not fall. But very much for most of the other commodities and industries, it fell sharply. Next, please. Next, please. We can skip this also. Yeah. So there was a similarity between the challenges that came out of not only not COVID-19, which we can see the similarity with the global financial crisis. Both initially led to a global collapse of global trade. But the rebound in the case of COVID was really fast, and it was really led by China and the East Asian countries. And part of the story actually has to do with global value chains. And we remember that there was a shortage of PPEs and masks and so many other things. And initially, countries did have export controls and other kinds of things. But after a point, after 2-3 months, some of that eased up. So basically, what it meant is that the recovery was possible because global value chains started functioning again, and it really was led by that. And so depending on whether the countries were integrated either through the backward participation or through the forward participation, the recovery was uneven, but it happened, and it happened for most countries. Next, please. Now, some statistics again from 2020. Germany and United States and Switzerland, they actually supply the 35% of medicinal products across the world. As far as PP is concerned, China, Germany, and the US exported about 40%. So you can see that so much of global trade is actually concentrated in a few countries. In medical products, for example, again, it was led by the EU. And so while there was a trade collapse following COVID in the first quarter or the second quarter of 2020, the recovery that happened started because some of these items were, the export controls were removed and countries started trading with each other, firstly in medical products and PPE, and then other things like, even ventilators and all of that. Initially, countries had imposed a lot of tariff on some things. Even something like, hand soap had a tariff of about, pre-COVID, it was 17%. It increased to about 65%. All of that got rationalized as the initial fear or initial of COVID waned. Next, please. And you can see this basically shows you how much the blip in global world trade happened due to COVID. So 2021 first quarter, the sharp dip that you can see is explained by the shutdown that happened in all of the world. And then the recovery that happened was as countries started trading with each other. And the recovery was again quite sharp initially. But then interestingly, where the recovery will finally go now depends on how the Ukraine war pans out, because the recovery is in part going to be determined by that. Next, please. So the new trends that we are seeing in global value chains due to the Ukraine war is that disruptions. A lot of things have got disrupted, but even before actually the Ukraine war started, there were disruption in chips. You had that problem in the Suez Canal and the piling up of the containers in either in China or on the US. So the disruptions that have started since 2020, all of that has not gone away, and in some product or the other, the disruption continues. It will also mean that because of this current war, there will be the global alliances could also change. And just to give an example, can I go next slide, please? This is data from WTO, and it shows you the share of Russian and Ukrainian imports in total imports of some countries. And so, for example, from wheat, you can see on the extreme left-hand column, Mongolia imports 100% of its wheat from Russia. The red color ones are Russia, the yellow color ones are Ukraine. And of particular concern for countries like India and Nepal also has been what has been our exposure to, say, Ukraine or Russia. So, for example, for India, in maize, we are 70% of our maize is imported from Ukraine. We have a lot of exposure as far as oil is concerned and other commodities is concerned. Next, please. I think skip, please. Next one, also skip. And yeah, this is the slide that I want to talk about. So what the Ukraine war is actually doing is creating some trade diversion as well as leading to some trade creation elsewhere. Now you can see that I have picked up some commodities which are of India's interest and tried to see whether it represents an opportunity or a challenge. So, for example, as far as fertilizers is concerned, we import 13% of our nitrogenous fertilizer from Russia, and quite a significant amount of phosphatic fertilizers also from Russia. So, as far as fertilizers is concerned, on the balance, it is a challenge for India. Oil seeds, we import, sunflower oil seeds particularly, we import from both, we import from Ukraine largely, and this also could be somewhat of a challenge, though India does export some oil seeds, that is a smaller amount. Wheat is one area where it could be an opportunity for India, because though India in fact does produce a lot of wheat, it typically does not export its wheat because it consumes it all domestically. India is a large rice exporter, but then if 9% of world's wheat is, which is contribution of Ukraine, and 16% is contribution from Russia. If 25% really goes away from the market, this actually is an opportunity. And similarly, there could be other kinds of opportunity in other products. But the other two items that I've listed, which is a challenge for India, as far as petroleum crude is concerned, 10% of petroleum crude in the world is exported by Russia. And as I shown earlier also, India does export, but that is refined. And which means that suppose the crude is not available, obviously we would not be able to export the refined petroleum, and that could be another challenge. Similarly, for liquefied natural gas, this is a challenge. Now, typically when we talk about global value chains, we only see the total exports, but you can see that the imports also matter. So and that is really brought out in the case of the petroleum story, because if the crude is not available, the refined petroleum cannot be exported. So this is why the linkage with the global value chains and the the sanctions that are there against Russia have and will lead to so much unbalance or disbalance in the world, that the global value chains could be really redrawn and reformulated. Next, please. So by way of conclusion, we need to recognize our manufacturing strength based on not only our exports and competitiveness. We have to look at the importance of imports, and just the Ukraine war has brought out clearly the importance of imports and global value chains, particularly the backward linkages. It is very important. The lead firms play a very important role. And while there are many examples of lead firms, but how to foster lead firms in countries that do not have lead firms, or how to encourage integration and moving up the value chain, is something that most countries lack. And in that context, basically GVC specific policies are needed, whether they are horizontal, vertical, or policies that address problems of specific sectors. Next, please. So just to conclude, there has been and there will be redrawing of value chains. And the impact of the Ukraine war has to be seen not only in terms of the exports that Ukraine had, but also the exports that Russia has. And Russia, in fact, is a far more integrated in that sense, at least in the energy and the in the energy space, and which would basically mean that some of it would be redrawn, either because of the sanctions or because some new trade routes would be opened up because of the war. Now, what it basically means is that how resilient are your supply chains, and whether they can withstand these kinds of shocks like the war. There have been other kinds of problems that countries have faced in the past. For example, one typical example that is given is that China's trade war with the US. That had a ripple effect across the world. And similarly, this Ukraine war will have the similar kind of ripple effect throughout the world. We are talking about food, particularly in the context of African countries, and we are talking about food also, maybe in the context of many other countries, which do not produce enough food themselves. And finally, specifically for India, the other things that have been bones of contention is staying out of the regional agreement, RCEP, and the recognition of the role of FDIs and the inflows that it plays in global value chains and manufacturing, and the linkage with services, which is very important, but often not highlighted or understood enough. I will stop here. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. It basically shows you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so this is this talk is really based on this book in 2018, Global Value Chains and Missing Links, Cases from Indian Industry. It essentially asks these three questions. What is evidence? What is the evidence on India's integration? Why does India lag behind in GVC participation? And what can be done to enhance India's participation? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and it was a great session. We enjoyed it and learned a lot about the global value chains. And we have received some questions through Facebook live chat and some inbox messages. So there are some questions that I want to put forward, but somehow some of the questions are already answered during the presentation. So even though, let me present some questions here. As you have said, you have already explained what are the biggest emerging challenges on the horizon for GVC participation. That was also a question. And the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered a debate as to whether the global So what are the impacts of COVID-19 on global value chains? So you have already almost mentioned. So if you want, you can repeat this. You can put some highlight on that. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, regional value chains are expected to gain momentum to strike a balance between localized and globalization. So what is your opinion on that, this regard, like the regional value chains? So let's go through first these three questions, then we will see other questions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. COVID-19, though I have already talked about it, I'll just talk about it briefly. Now, one thing that we have not, I have not touched about in my presentation is the impact that COVID-19 had on the services sector. And it was actually particularly bad. If you look at tourism, the transport sector was very badly hit, in the entire hospitality industry. And so countries which are dependent on tourism and hospitality industries have been really badly affected. And we've heard about the Sri Lankan context also in this case. Many other countries have been really very badly impacted. Some of the services have rebounded, but I think the pace at which the services sector was performing prior to COVID, it has not gone back to those days. And because when a new wave comes, everything is again temporarily, at least partially shut down. And so those kinds of problems still remain. And the other thing that I didn't talk about is the impact that COVID had on the poverty. And there have been some estimates that world poverty, in fact, in absolute terms, went up by about between 6 to 10%, and which is a huge, huge shock for the entire global economy. Yeah, it has been suggested that the pandemic will or led to more regional value chains, because again, mainly because of the problems related to the transport sector. But regional value chains, if they existed prior to the pandemic, those have thrived. This is my assessment that new chains, though they have happened, have not really happened because of the regional nature. They have happened largely because, again, it makes business sense. Ultimately, it makes business sense to be engaged with a country. So, we've seen that across the world, people have tended to go back to the pre-pandemic behavior as soon as the wave has abated. And I think that is true as far as even business is concerned. So in some cases, maybe regional value chains have increased, but not in all cases. So again, I think it is a bit varied, the picture. And I think the third question was how to increase integration.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So now that is the question. Now, see, India has been trying to increase its integration for a long time, and some of it has increased because of some government policies. But there are those bottlenecks that we need to address. So it could be things like logistics problems, or it could be infrastructure problems, or it could be the high cost of labor, which you cannot. It's not that easy to resolve. So there are problems which are they can be solved easily and in the short run, but there are institutional problems which are more difficult to solve. And again, the answer is that there is no unique answer for any particular industry. Sometimes this will vary from industry to industry and from country to country. And I think that is what we need to recognize, that since all industries do not behave in the same way or not integrated in the same way, the solution also cannot be a unique solution. It has to be a case-specific solution.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Let's see some other questions. There is a question. Unless production facilitates of large number of products and their critical components are produced in India, can play little role in the global supply chain. So what are the sectors where India have the strength to play a role, and what India is doing about it? Okay, let me put other questions also. In this fast evolving context, as global companies adapt their manufacturing and supply chain strategies to build resilience, India has a unique opportunity to become a global manufacturing hub. So what are the possibilities and opportunities for India? Let's go through these two questions.
Right. Two or three sectors in which India is actually very well integrated in global value chains. One is the auto industry. And the second one, I would say, is to some extent the chemical industry also. Some part of the chemical industry, I wouldn't say the entire industry, and also pharmaceutical. I should not forget to mention that. In the auto, India's products are cheaper than what are produced in the rest of the world. In fact, Indian two-wheelers as well as cars have been supplied to many countries, including Europe. So the auto sector is clearly one sector where India is doing very well. In pharmaceuticals, again, India is really a large supplier. I mean, the entire generics industry of the pharmaceutical industry, India is the generic supplier to the entire world. But then the problem there also is that from generics, you need to go on to more specialized and other, more, I would say, higher value added drugs in that sense. And there, India doesn't seem to be doing that well. And in terms of the second question, that how can India become the global manufacturing hub? Most of the, this is really the realm of industrial policy. But then it is not only industrial policy. One has to recognize that industrial policy as well as trade policy and technology policy, all of that has to come together for a country to become a hub, a manufacturing hub. And while this is a necessity, and some of it we are seeing in the 14 sector PLI schemes that have been ushered in since last year, these will take time. They will take at least 2-3 years in those 14 sectors that have been identified. In some of the others, so it means basically that these are newer sectors where we expect to become hubs, or at least production hubs, in the next 2-3 years. But at the same time, in sectors where we are doing well, like autos, or even say generic pharmaceuticals, specialty chemicals, or reactive dyes, we need to be continuing what the other things that we are doing, and continue to remain competitive. most importantly. In sectors that we are not doing well, I mean, the typical story that we have is in garments, we are always losing out to Bangladesh. There it's a different kind of problem. We are not cost competitive. There are the slowness at or turnaround at ports is a problem. We are not linked to the value chains in that sense. And we actually produce very much more niche kind of garments. We are not a mass producer. So there is no way actually that we can become competitive unless we do many things. I mean, so which means things like land availability, cheaper electricity, water in some cases, investment in synthetic fibers, and all of that. And so this kind of list is there for every sector. So the thing is that, again, so just to reiterate, which means that, again, a sector specific approach, as well as the general problems that are there, the logistics and all that, have to be taken care of.
Yeah. Thank you very much, ma'am. With this, I will take only 2 questions, then we will end the session. Let me check. Yeah, there is a question regarding what are the roles of multinational corporation in global value chains? And the last question for today I will take, why integrating with global value chains crucial for India? And where do you see India in global value chains participation in the next 5 or 10 years from now? Yeah, this will be our final question.
Yeah. Thank you. So the role of my MNCs is very critical. Most often the lead firm is a multinational. It could be in cases where there is technology, it could be a domestic firm also. So in fact, in our study, we did identify across the sectors that we studied which is the lead firm and what kind of behavior that it is doing. Now, MNCs play a role not only in terms of the investment they bring in, they play a role in bringing in the technology also. And so the role is very critical. Right now, in the one sector that India is trying to develop is the electric vehicle sector. Again, in that context, we are seeing the role of multinationals trying to bring in the investment into the country. They are facing certain problems, but on the whole, it seems to be working in some states. It's working quite well. India is already assembling rather, shouldn't say producing, a large number of 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. Not so many 4-wheelers, of course. And the importance of integration. How can integration help? Now, see, the thing is that as countries, when we export, what is the objective? You want to earn foreign exchange. You want to actually maybe, and at the back of that is also the jobs that are associated. So integration in global value chains is important not only from the point of view of the technology that the MNC is bringing in or the kind of exports that you can do. It also means things like produce, at the end of the day, jobs. And this is a very critical, it's of very critical importance for India, because our manufacturing employment in manufacturing has been really stagnating for quite some time now. It has not increased, and we need to provide as many jobs as possible if we want to grow faster than before. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, ma'am. Finally, here we come to the end of the discussions. Thank you for the insightful presentation, and it was a great opportunities to learn from you about the GVC. I would like to also thank our participants and audience for their wonderful questions. And we still have some questions, but due to time constraints, we will not take that. So have a nice day, and I will ask our dear participants to join our upcoming sessions. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.